Good morning. Sorry, that was really loud. We're going to have our teaching text today from Mark 8:34. Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for bringing us here today. Thank you for every person in this room. Thank you for bringing it on their hearts to show their worship for you and be here today. Lord, I just ask that in this time, as we move into Thanksgiving, you remind us to be thankful for what you've given us, that we may radically love others, and that we serve you. It's in your Son's name. Thank you. Amen.
Amen. We live from the heart. And every day, our lives are pointed in a particular direction. Now, that direction is not decided by the ideals we claim to hold, but rather the sum of our affections and attention. As sons and daughters of the Enlightenment, we love to think of ourselves as rational and logical beings. But all of the data and lived experience show that we, in fact, live from the heart. You see, the heart is the language the biblical authors use to describe the depths of the inner person, the place we live our lives from. You see, it is from the heart that we see the world, that we make our decisions, that we respond into action, and that we interpret reality. And this heart is formed by who or what we follow. To put it simply, you are not who you think you are who you have been formed into. It is with every moment of every day and with every decision that you are in the process of becoming. You see, human beings are dynamic, that is to say, always in motion. And so the question is not, am I being formed? The question is rather, who am I becoming? The forming of this heart often happens unintentionally. Much of this formation is unintentional, meaning that our hearts are cultivated by the strongest currents around us. It is formed by the environments we live in, the stories we believe, the habits we have formed, and the company we keep. Let's talk unintentional formation. In my conversation with most people, this is the framework for their formation. They just get up and do the thing, right? Whatever the thing is, work or family or church, whatever it is, whatever is put before them, that is what they do. And most of their life is lived in autopilot. Most of their life is just responding to the things that are. And much of their life is not given great intention and thought process behind it. It's just what is, and then they do the thing. When we are not intentional about the lives we lead, we drift towards the areas that pull us the strongest, often without us even knowing it. And this is the paradigm of unintentional formation. I'm borrowing here a lot from the work of John Mark Comer. And so the first area I want to talk about is the environments we live in. The places in which we find ourselves have deeply formative powers behind them. And so this is both physical environments and digital environments. Let's talk first physical. Living in New Mexico, primarily the Albuquerque Metro / Valencia County area, has deep formative things on you that you don't even realize till you're in a different place. A lot of this year, my wife and I have done a lot of traveling. And basically everywhere we've gone, we're like, where's the heat to the food, right? It's always missing something. And we're always those people asking for hot sauce at all of these restaurants. Why? Because where we have lived has actually formed our palate. The way that we digest and eat food, it's missing something, and so we have to add a heat element to it. Now that's silly, but it changes our language, it changes our desires, it changes the way that we think the world works. Much of us would actually get culture shock being in a large city because the dynamics are totally different. Other places in the country, right? It is not common to like say hello to random strangers you're walking past or how you doing, that common thing. That's not normal in other places. People would think, what's wrong with you? What do you want from me, right? If you're engaging in that kind of conversation. And these are silly little things, but they have deep formative effects on you. And here's the thing, you had no idea this is already happening to you. It just happened. You just are. And those are our physical environments. There's also our digital environments, and these have deep formative impacts on who we are. You see, the environments digitally that we immerse ourselves in, shaped by algorithms and user data, form who we are. Our interests, our perspectives, our disposition, all of these are being formed by what you expose yourself to. And all of this happens without you even realizing it. The environments we live in. The next is the stories we believe. As I've said multiple times, we are narrative beings, meaning the way that we make sense of the world is not through a series of information and data, right? It is through stories. It is through narratives that we make sense of the world. What we believe about ourselves, the world around us, our ultimate purpose and trajectory is formed by the stories we believe. The stories we believe shape the futures we live into. Next is the habits that we have formed. What we do on a regular basis, we become. Or to put it another way, the things we do something to us. And most of your habits have formed without you even realizing it. You just have begun to do this certain thing, and that certain thing has shaped the way that you live your life. Whether it be a small thing like brushing your teeth before bed, right? That's a positive thing. Or adding flossing to your regimen, which this is your reminder to add floss to your regimen, right? But whatever this little simple thing is, it has a formative impact on your life. And so the habits that we have formed actually form us. And some of these aren't good ones. Like maybe the first thing that you do when you open your eyes in the morning is with groggy eyes reach over for your phone. Now, it seems like whatever, and that's what your alarm's on and all this other stuff, right? As if there was no other alarms ever before the iPhone, right? But if the first 30 minutes of your day are spent scrolling through news articles and social media things, that has a formative reality in you. Because the very first thoughts you have throughout the day are not thoughts originating from you, but are being pressed upon you from whatever app it is you choose to open. It's formative. All of these things. And lastly is the company that we keep. It is no secret that we are like those whom we spend the most time with. Celeste and I spend obviously the most time together, and there's a lot of things that we do that we think are just totally normal until we're out in real world. That's like, oh yeah, that's totally not normal. The way that we the inside jokes that we have, the way that we talk, all this other stuff. And you guys have probably seen little bits and glimmers of this, right? But her and I have had such a deep impact and influence on one another without even realizing it. You have this within your little pocket of nuclear friends, the way that you talk, the jokes you have, the things you say, that you don't realize that those things aren't how the vernacular that everybody uses until you're outside of those areas. But all that to say, the people you spend the most time with shape your life. It has been said, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And that is absolutely true. The people who are closest around you are the ones who are offering advice and wisdom and direction and are slowly but surely shaping and forming you, and you all become like one another. And so of those you spend the most time with, how are they forming you? So in each of these things, the environments we live in, the stories we believe, the habits we have formed, and the company we keep, they shape who we become. And so here's the question this morning. Who are you becoming? Now, as we look at the landscape of Christian faith in the West, I believe we are experiencing something called a failure of formation. You see, it is outsiders that view followers of Jesus as the most judgmental, hypocritical, and unkind people. Now, to be honest, some of that critique is unfair, and some of that is rooted in all sorts of other things. But the great reality is most people feel that way because a lot of followers of Jesus are judgmental, hypocritical, and unkind. That followers of Jesus fail to model Christ-likeness. Now, there's obviously some who model this in a beautiful and compelling way, but by and large, this is the most common critique because it's true. To put it simply, we have failed to become like the one we claim to follow. And I think that we are bearing the kind of fruit you get when you sow the kind of seeds we've sown. We have made following Jesus all about knowledge and morality and have overlooked character. Here's what I mean. First is knowledge. In many circles, it's all about believing the right thing, believing the right information, and strong emphasis on Bible and theology. Now, hear me in this. If you know anything about me, I love Bible and theology. I love to talk these things. I love to nuance all this stuff out, but this is the primary emphasis. It is only about believing the right things. And so, is this what following Jesus sums up to be? Well, you can know how to exegete a text, wrestle through the nuances of the doctrine of atonement, but still not look like Jesus. Knowledge is important, but it's certainly not enough. The next is that of morality. You see, it is in a lot of circles, it's all about the do's and the don'ts. It is about simply modifying our behavior to conform to a certain image. And hear me in this, holiness absolutely matters. And the good news of Jesus should absolutely change your behavior. But following Jesus is so much more. See, you can excel in objective morality, but fail to be like Jesus. And the prime example that we have of people who overemphasize these two areas are the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day. No one knew the scriptures or obeyed the law better than the Pharisees, yet they missed God before their very eyes. Hear the words of Jesus. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. I believe we're encountering a failure of formation. We've made following Jesus primarily about believing the right things and the do's and don'ts of our faith. You know, it's funny, in most churches, they are fighting straw men with theological arguments that nobody is having. It is the common experience that from the pulpit, people are trying to attack the proverbial boogeyman through these theological scarecrows they construct just to deconstruct him, when really nobody in the room is asking those questions. Have you been in a room like that? That somebody from the pulpit is hammering away against Calvinism or Arminianism, these doctrines of salvation, and people are like, dude, I'm just trying to be a good dad. And so they've made these things the things that we focus on and over-prioritize, and not that they're not important, because they are, but they've made it more important than our character. And then about objective morality, it's about coming in and dressing a certain way and talking a certain way and just giving this perception of holiness, but deep down within the heart it is corrupt and full of hypocrisy. And when that culture is invited, it permeates so that anybody who walks into the room doesn't have the power to change that existing culture, but conforms to the culture they walk into, and they learn how to construct the mask themselves. And so we're all playing the game. It's all about believing the right things and the do's and don'ts, but inside we're dying. And this is the critique of Jesus. And here's how we know this is what's underneath. Christ has exposed this. The last 2 years, if they've taught us anything, they've taught us what we actually trust in. They taught us what our faith is actually put in. And for many people who claim to follow Jesus, it's not him. It's all sorts of other things. And I'll leave it to you to fill in those blanks. And so what do we do? What do we do in this process that we are currently being formed and we're experiencing a failure of that formation? We need a new paradigm. We need a new vision for formation, which would be intentional formation. Our greatest need of the hour is not more information, nor is it behavior modification. It is, hear me in this, a transformed heart. Now, this process does not happen by accident. You will never just stumble into Christ-likeness. It is not that you just simply pray a prayer in the middle of the night and then you stumble into the life God longs you to lead. It is a process that's done through intention. We need, hear me in this, a carefully cultivated heart. For us not to drift to whatever the strongest pull is requires us to be intentional about what we are allowing in our lives. And this process, first and foremost, begins with God. So, here's intentional formation. It all begins first and foremost with the influence and power of the Spirit. The work of formation is not merely a human endeavor. It is a partnership with the Spirit of God to make us more like Jesus. The OG on spiritual formation, Dallas Willard, says this: Christian spiritual formation is the Spirit-driven process of forming the inner world of the human self in such a way that it becomes like the inner being of Christ himself. Formation is not merely an exercise in willpower. Now hear me in this: willpower is good and important and will serve you in following Jesus, but it is not enough. You see, often we fall on one or two equal and opposite extremes. Either it's all God or it's all me. First is the it's all God people, right? They think that transformation happens by just sitting there underneath God and that he's just going to change you. That like if you just pray hard enough that boom, selfishness gone, right? Like that somehow God will just upload into your being goodness and you will no longer have these things. Like I'm impatient, pray. Look, now I'm patient. Everybody's good, right? Like that's how it's going to be. And that's how we change. And they are by and large super immature. The other half is that it's the all me people. You know what I'm saying? They read the fruit of the Spirit and they try to muster these up with their own strength. That I'm going to be loving today or something like that. And that willpower lasts about 30 minutes. And if you're really strong, maybe an hour, right? But outside of that, willpower is gone. You've lost the ability, and they feel like they're failing in their discipleship. Both of them. But it's because they're having the equal and opposite errors. It is not just God or just us. It is a partnership with God. And us becoming like Jesus. The Spirit empowers the work of formation. It is opening our lives up to the Spirit's work in us through carefully cultivating our hearts. And the end goal is that our lives would be fully immersed in the awareness of the presence of God. That the presence of God would permeate every fiber of our being and that his presence becomes our primary reality. To use the language of Paul, that we would walk in the Spirit. So it is first and foremost an endeavor of the Spirit. Secondarily, it is about the teaching we follow. Jesus came as a rabbi, as a teacher, because teaching is important and it matters. Consider his most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, where he confronts our brokenness and invites us into the vision of life shaped by the kingdom. This is what we're doing right now. And this is what I give a bulk of my life to, is the work of teaching. And the best kind of teaching does this. It gives a vision of what's possible, and it exposes lies. And it does both simultaneously. First, it gives a vision of what's possible. It paints a picture of the life that is available to the person hearing if they were to respond. And secondarily, it exposes lies. It confronts people on where they actually are and the trust structures that they have. And so the teaching that we follow shapes us in contrast to the stories that we believe. So often, when you read the scriptures, Jesus confronts the stories you believe about yourself, about the world, and about your neighbor. And that teaching forms and shapes us. Next is the practices that we walk in. Next is the practices, otherwise known as spiritual disciplines. To put it simply, these are simply just habits that we form, habits we form to make us more like Jesus. Now, I want to be clear here. The power is not in the practice itself, but the power comes as the practice serves as a pathway to the presence of God. But we will touch on that more later. And lastly, it's the community we commit to. So most of the relationships you have in your life, you choose, right? You choose the people that you hang around with. You choose those who you allow to have influence in your life. You choose who you're going out to coffee with. Community in the family of Jesus, you don't choose that. And often, it's for your good. Because if I'm curating my friends list, they're all like me, right? They like the things that I like. They don't like the things I don't like, right? We all have commonalities. You step into one of our community groups, there is no way, right? We could have paid all those people to hang out together on their own outside of that room. But it is the family of Jesus that brings us together, and it's all these different walks of life that rub against us. And this call to community is this commitment to not just be friends, but it's to pursue God's best for one another. And so in community, two things happen. One, you get exposed. The next, you get encouraged. Being around people who love you more than they love your friendship will tell you what is true about you. And sometimes that's painful to hear, but it needs to be heard. I've heard it said that community functions like a sponge. It simply just exposes that which was already in there. But it's not just that. It's not just like the trial of Andrew at community group, right? It's also encouragement. Because when I'm believing lies about myself, my community calls me to that what is true. And they call me up to the way of Jesus and all the things that are possible there. And so this is a vision for intentional formation. Now, we've been in this series entitled Ordinary Radicals, where we've been mapping onto this Moravian community to awaken our imagination as what is possible here in our context within this community. And the Moravians had a vision of formation, something they called the Order of the Mustard Seed. You see, this community organized their life around something called a rule of life. Now, a rule of life is essentially a schedule, a set of practices and relational rhythms that create space in our lives for the presence of God, that we may live lives that Jesus says to the full. Now, I know rule is kind of like a weird word, and you probably really don't like it that much, but it doesn't mean rules in the sense of like, here are the obligatory things we need to follow. But rule actually simply means a trellis. It is a support structure that makes it possible for things to grow well. As a trellis does for a vine, it gives it a structure to weave its life through that it may share in abundance. This is what a rule of life does for us. It is a support structure to simply help us grow well. And so they called their rule of life the Order of the Mustard Seed. And their order was simple. It was three things: be true to Christ, be kind to people, and take the gospel to the nations. And it is from these three things that immense beauty was born out of this community. It was by these shared commitments and practices that a support structure was set in place that gave birth to people, a small group of refugees starting the modern missions movement, as we talked about last week. A community of less than 300, sending over 200 people to 10 countries all across the world in less than 30 years. It also birthed a prayer movement that, again, this small community prayed every hour, every day for over 100 years. This rule of life, this structure, provided that which they could grow into. And they took their own formation seriously. So in the time that we have remaining today, I want us to consider the invitation of Jesus into discipleship, look at the vision of discipleship, and lastly, formation in our church moving forward. So, the invitation of discipleship. The ancient way of talking about this process of formation is something we call discipleship. Now, I realize for a lot of you, this probably already has preconceived notions in your mind. Like when you think discipleship, you think of like sitting across the table from somebody who's like older than you by like 20 years. You're at a coffee shop, you're working through some sort of curriculum. That's discipleship. Now, that's good, and there's nothing wrong with that. So if you're doing that, please continue to do that. But is that what Jesus had in mind when he used the word disciple? And is that the framework he had in mind for discipleship? So the first question that we have to answer is this: what is a disciple? The Greek word is the word mathetes. Can you say mathetes? And the Hebrew word is talmudim. Can you say that? All right, 3 of you were really confident. The rest of you just mouthed it. I saw it. It means simply follower or student or apprentice. And we think that apprentice is the best word. What is the goal of apprenticeship? The goal of apprenticeship is to do that what you're training to do. If you are an apprentice barber, the goal is that at the end of the apprenticeship, you are a what? Barber. Not a fireman, right? That's the goal. It's like the goal if you're apprenticing under somebody is to ultimately do what they do, become what they are, right? If you're an electrician apprentice, the goal at the end of your apprenticeship is to be, guys, I wrote that on the test for you, an electrician, right? We're going to try one more. If you are an apprentice plumber, the goal is for you to one day be a, look at you, there we are. This is the idea of discipleship. And this idea was not original to Jesus. Jesus is already existing within Jesus is operating within an already existing framework. There was already an existing framework of discipleship for the Jewish people. So it looked like this. When you were a kid, growing up as a Jewish kid, you would go to something called Bet Sefer, which is called House of the Book. And this was the Jewish education system. So from the time you're very little to the time you're 12 years old, you commit yourself to this. And in this process, you memorize the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. You steep yourself into the story of God and your people. And then once 12 years rolls around, a great majority of people went off to do their own things, either get married or enter into the family business or whatever. But for the very best students amongst that group, they would enter into something called Beit Talmud, which was the idea of house of learning. And so the top students would go to this place and they would go learn further and expand their education. Think of like an undergrad degree or something like that. They would go and expand their education a bit further. And only the very, very top of those would be invited to be a disciple. So Jesus was a rabbi, a pre-existing thing at the time. And a rabbi was a teacher. And a teacher would have a set of disciples. These disciples were chosen by them. Think about like the competition to get into like a Harvard or a Yale. It was something very similar. It was very prestigious to get into the school of a rabbi. Very competitive, very hard to do. And so all these rabbis had people vying for these spots, and they would choose only the best. And they would follow their rabbi, and they would become a disciple. Now, let's consider Jesus' invitation, where he says this in our teaching text. He called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said this: whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. The first invitation I want you to notice is this: whoever. The limitations for entering discipleship to Jesus, the door is wide open. Whomever. Do you want to? Come on board. The door is wide open for anybody to be a disciple. And look at the people that Jesus grabs. Are they the smartest in society? The most wealthy? The most prominent? Often, no. The most hated, the most outcast are the ones who become his inner 12. And larger than that, the crowd. And so This call was available for men and women, rich and poor, educated and uneducated. The door is wide open for who could be his disciple. But notice the next invitation. He says this, must deny themselves and take up their cross. Jesus is clear. The door is wide open, but the path, the way, is narrow. Because the call is the call to come and die, to come and lay your life down. Now, when we hear this, we might think that sounds outright awful, and that's terrible PR. Like, Jesus needs a better PR person if he wants more people into his school of discipleship. But Jesus is honest about what this call means. And it's this, that in order for new things to be born, sometimes old things need to die. And that is especially true in us. The call for Jesus is not to add Jesus on to your already busy life. It's not to like squeeze Jesus in when you have some time here and there. The call to Jesus is to drop your nets and follow him. It is a whole life surrendered to him. The way of Jesus is instead a surrender to him and to allow him to begin the process of transforming you. It is in the dying of yourself that is letting go of the parts of you that are corrupt and broken and allowing yourself to be remade in his image. The idea of being transformed is the word metamorphosis. And it's this idea, right, of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. It is this death of one thing to bring about the newness of another. It is about this entity reaching its full redemptive potential. And this is the invitation of Jesus. That the way of self-denial, the way of suffering, the way of the cross is the way we reach our redemptive potential. And not many will journey down this road. Isn't that what Jesus says? That narrow is the way that leads to life. Because here's the thing. Many of us want to have Jesus follow us and what we're already on about rather than follow Jesus where he's going. So the way is narrow. Thinking about our series title again, the idea of the word radical, meaning to the very root. The call of Jesus is that. It is radical. It is getting to the very core of who you are. And lastly is his invitation to follow me. What does it mean to follow Jesus? We use this language all the time, don't we? I'm a follower of Jesus. Are you a follower of Jesus? I mean, I don't know how many people you're asking that, but like that's the framework that we use. But do we really understand what that means? For the disciples that Jesus called, this wasn't like ethereal, like in your mind, follow me. It was like literally get up and go where I'm going. Notice that when he calls the disciples, they drop what it is they're doing and they go and follow Jesus where he's going. It's not like, I'll follow you here from the boat. Keep me updated on Instagram. I'll see what you're doing. It's I'm literally going to follow you. And this was the framework of discipleship, that they would go everywhere Jesus is going, do exactly what Jesus did, and they would take on his life, his pattern of living as their own. To quote John Mark, he says this, to have the life of Jesus, we must take on the lifestyle of Jesus. For us to be formed by our Rabbi Jesus is to follow him in that same way. Followers of Jesus were known primarily not as Christians, but as people called the Way. And this was because the way became sort of a euphemism to talk about following Jesus, following a rabbi, that there was a way, and the idea of a way is literally a path or a journey that you would embark down. And so these people became known as the Way because the way in which they patterned and lived their lives after Jesus. And so how do we do this? Well, we say it's three things: to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do what Jesus did. This is our vision of following Jesus. First, be with Jesus. Hear his words in Mark chapter 3. He appointed 12 that they might what? Be with him, and that he may send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. Discipleship, formation, following Jesus, hear me this, begins first in the place of presence. Before it is ever about doing or learning, it is simply about being with God. And all of life could be summed up as pursuing the presence of God. This is what it's all about. Consider Jesus' words in John 15. He says this, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain or abide or dwell or live in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. The word here, remain, is the Greek word meno. Literally means abide. Some people have gone as far to say that this means to relax in Jesus, to make your home with him. Brother Lawrence, a famous monk, described this relationship with God as simply this, practicing the presence of God. Dallas Willard called this keeping God before our minds. It is about being with him. How do we do that? That sounds very spiritual, doesn't it? It sounds kind of ethereal. Like, how do we encounter the presence of God? Theology test, where is Jesus right now? Seated at the right hand of the Father, right? That's, theologically speaking, that's where he physically is right now. And so it's like, how do we get there, right? And how do we have him here? Think about the words that Jesus tells his disciples. He says, it's better that I go, that I may send you who? The Spirit, right? And he may dwell inside of you. God's presence now lives within those who call Christ their Lord. And this presence is available for you. All you must simply do is pay attention. Open your life up to the Spirit's influence. Now, I want you to think about the words that Jesus leaves his disciples with. The very last thing that he tells them is this, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. The promise, the reality of following Jesus first is about being with him. Second, it's becoming like him. The goal of apprenticing under Jesus is that we would be like him. In the language of Paul, to be conformed into the image of the Son. That who we are at our core would be formed into a person of love. And that love would be the mark of maturity in Jesus. The end goal for us, newsflash, is to be like Jesus. Is to be like the one we claim to follow, is to become like our rabbi. And lastly, is to do what Jesus did. To put it another way, what would Jesus do if he were you? And to live into that reality. Live into all that God has for us, and to walk in the power and the gifts of the Spirit, stepping into our calling, etc. Be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. Leading us to this, that we would be practicing the way of Jesus together in Valencia County. This is the goal of our formation. This is the goal of what we long to do in this church, is be a church who follows after Jesus in this way. Now, if that's the vision of it, how is this actually done? Like, how does the rubber meet the road? And for this, it would be something called practices and or spiritual disciplines. I like practices way better. Spiritual disciplines sounds kind of harsh, right? If I was like, hey, come over to my house, let's do spiritual disciplines. You're like, nah, I'm good, right? Practices is a way better, I think, thing. And I think it captures the heart. John Mark again says this, the practices are habits based on the lifestyle of Jesus that do this. Create time and space for us to access the presence and power of the Father, and in doing so, be transformed by the Spirit. So there's 9 essential practices in following Jesus, and they're this: Sabbath, prayer, fasting, solitude, scripture, community, simplicity, generosity, and hospitality. Now, I know that seems like a lot right now, and you're probably like, ooh, I scored 1 out of 9 or something like that, right? We will talk about these more and more in the upcoming years and months to follow. But those are the 9 that we see from the life of Jesus that we're going to integrate into our own lives to become like our rabbi. And so to kind of close this thing down, I want to talk about what is formation going to look like in our church? Like, how are we going to do this in 2023? This quote haunts me, so I thought the only right thing to do is to share it with you so you can be haunted alongside with me. Sharing my pain, please. It is this. Ultimately, each church will be evaluated by one thing: its disciples. Your church is only as good as its disciples. It does not matter how good your praise, preaching, programs, or property are. If your disciples are passive, needy, consumerist, and not moving in the direction of radical obedience, hear this, your church is not good. That's what we're on about. When Jesus commissioned his disciples, he said, you know what you guys really need to do? Have some super dope worship. Really cool, aesthetically pleasing building. Do some like good things for the community once in a while. Stellar coffee. Set that bar real high, you know? And then just like hang out on Sundays when you want to, when life's not too inconvenient, you know? And if you think about me, talk to me. If not, no big deal, whatever, you know? And I'll see you at the end of the age. Peace. That's not what he said. If you're wondering, that's not what he said. He said, go and make disciples. That as disciples, we make disciples. And we haven't even begun the first process of being disciples yet. We're just inviting Jesus into our already busy life to come and do what we're doing. And so, we're going to take formation super seriously at this church. We're going to take becoming like Jesus very seriously at this church. I say it all the time, and you might be sick of it, but whatever, let's just make t-shirts. We don't want to talk about it. We want to be about it. You know, it's one thing to sit here and like stir people up with like this super provocative talk, and I realize like today is super not that, right? That was not today's talk at all. No one's like, I've been inspired to do this thing. But this is our vision. This is what we long to do. We long to be like our Rabbi Jesus. And look, if you're looking for something else, we love you, we bless you, but this isn't the church for you. Because we really want to do the thing. We really want to follow Jesus. We really want to become in his image. And so if you're looking for just like good programming and a comfortable thing or whatever, then wonderful, the Lord bless you. But that's not here. We really want to follow Jesus. We really want to allow the Spirit to permeate our lives in such a way that it would change the way that we live. And that from this transformation, we would live out of that and be sent into the world to seek and save the lost. To invite people into God's new reality and new kingdom that's on the way. That's what we're about. And that's what we're going to continue to be about as we move forward. So pragmatically speaking, a few years ago, we launched something called House of Learning. And essentially, this is like our equipping and teaching and training for the community that is Zion City Church. And it's looked like all sorts of things in the past, preaching and teaching courses and prayer training and things like that. So in the upcoming year, we plan to run another prayer course where if we're going to cash in all our chips to pray, we want to train people how to pray. We are also going to do something called a prayer training, which is different than the prayer course, in that we're going to train people how to pray for other people and to begin to make that a part of the life and body here at Zion. We're also going to be opening up our prayer room, which is right now in its early stages of conception and dreaming and praying, but the goal is, and maybe this is an unrealistic goal, but the goal is to have it launched by the new year. An entire space dedicated for praying here in our building. Next is we're going to be doing something called the Missional Life Course, where we're not just going to talk about missions theoretically, but we're going to learn how to live on mission to Jesus wherever it is that we find ourselves. And something also that we're doing, some of you guys have heard whispers of, is something called the 5-year journey, where I've taken a smaller circle of people to pour my life into, to train up and raise up people with a pastoral gift and call to pour into the body that we have here. And these are just some. I don't have the authority or permission yet to reveal others, so that's all you get. But this is our goal. We want to pour into this. We want to leverage this. In Ephesians 4, Paul says that the job of leadership is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. to put it in common English language, is to train you how to do what Jesus did where you're already going. That's the job of the leadership. It's not to do the thing for you. Like, it's not like, hey, come invite your friends to the Sunday gathering, and then we'll do ministry to them. It is like, hey, you are being sent, and you've been given the power of the living God inside of you to steward this gift where you're already going. How can we help you learn how to do that? That's the responsibility of leadership. And I feel like in the Western church, we've got it backwards. It's, hey, come to our event, come to our thing. And we love the Sunday gathering, and this is really important. And lastly, we're going to do something called practicing the way. So there's an organization called Practicing the Way, who I quoted him several times, John Mark Comer, helps lead. And it's going to be through these 9 practices that we've discussed to learn how to model and live these out in our church. And so in the coming year, we will be running this through our church to train us in these different things. To accompany, sermon series will be going through each of these as well. So I will preach a sermon series on each of these 9 practices in the coming months and years to come. And then we will circle back around and kind of circle the wagons together and do this periodically to go through all of these things together to integrate this into the life of our church, because we are cashing the chips here on formation. But we need this trellis. We need this structure in order to live and dwell in and bear beautiful fruit. Would you join me in standing, if you are able? So right now we want to respond. And this morning we were praying for you guys, and we just had a sense that the Lord was doing a few things. Quick caveat, this might be awkward. I'm not going to lie, it might be a little awkward. And we're going to do it till it's not awkward anymore. So like if you're hoping that like, if I just sit here long enough, he'll get tired and we'll do it. I'm pretty resilient, and I'm fine with awkwardness, so I'll let it ride. But we want to train our community to respond to the things that God is speaking, to begin the process of you embodying out the things God is doing in you by just taking a single step forward saying, yes, I'm responding to the call of God. And so, again, this might be awkward, and again, I don't care. I'm sorry. We're going to be awkward for a little while, and that's what it is, so cool. As long as you're down with it, I'm down with it. But anyways, we were praying for you. And we got some words, and I wanted to share those words because I feel like they were more than about the pre-gathering prayer service. They were actually for you coming in today. And this is an invitation of the Spirit to respond to what He's already been speaking in you. And so would you just join me in closing your eyes? And this is just a way just to rid yourself of distractions. There's nothing special about this. And I'm going to read these words out. And if any of them resonate with you, I'm going to invite you to respond, and I'm going to give you instructions on exactly how to do that. The first is this. One of our leaders saw a picture of a stream or a river running next to a mountainside, and they had this sense that this river was symbolic of the living waters of Jesus. And the invitation was to come and to place your feet in the water and to this receive refreshment. Maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you need refreshment. You've come in weary and tired and thirsty for an encounter with a living God. He says, come and be refreshed. The other word was a word that just simply we kept hearing over and over, presence, presence. We just had a sense that maybe one of you or some of you have not been being present in your own life lately. Haven't been being present with your family, your kids, your work. You've just been absent-minded away from there. And you feel the Spirit inviting you to be present again. We want to invite you to respond. The next thing that we saw was an image of a hand reaching up towards God. And we felt like the word was that God was reaching back down as well. And maybe that would describe you lately, that even maybe coming to service today was you reaching out for God, and God is reaching back out to you saying, I hear you, I see you, I love you. And lastly, we just had a sense that there are some people this morning who are really worried about the future. And you wonder how God is moving or if God is moving. And the Lord sees that, and He responds and saying, I am working in you. Though you may not see it, though you may not experience it, though you may not feel it, I am working. And He's inviting you this morning just to come and to surrender to that work that He's doing now. And so here's how I want to invite you to respond. If any of those resonated with you at any level, I just want to invite you to come forward and to embody a response and say, Holy Spirit, you're speaking to me, and I want to receive the word that you're sharing. And as you come to the front, if you would just place your hands open in front of you in the posture saying, I want to receive. And what's going to happen is we're going to have people who have been commissioned to come in to pray for you. And they're not going to interview you and ask you a million questions and invite you to sign up for something. They just want to bless you and bless the work that God is doing. Now, I realize this calls for an element of risk on your behalf. I'm not unaware of that. But often, to receive the gift God wants to give, it often comes through risk. And so I want to invite you into that boldly and then let you know that this is a safe place to take that risk and say, I want to receive that word. So if any of those words resonate with you at any level, would you just respond to the Holy Spirit and what he's speaking? Come forth, place your hands open, and people will come and pray with you. And as we do that, as you respond, our team will lead us in worship.